Well, hello there. How may I help you today? Oh, I see. You'd like to know about this town of Wollongong. Well, city as it is today. There are many fine tales I can tell you about this area, which they first called the Five Islands. But I suspect you might be after the truth and not the gossip. First of all, let me introduce myself. I'm Philip Mackle. I was born in Ireland, and I was the postmaster here in Wollongong back in the 1880s. The post office was the centre of communications for the whole township, what with mail and telegraph, and later, telephone. Telegrams were a very important way of communicating in the late 1800s. Yes, indeed. The post office was a vital part of the community.
But there were many other important aspects to life in Wollongong in the early days. Roads were not as you know them from today. Oh, no, they weren't. They were nothing more than tracks down the mountain and around the district. Why, in the early days, it was the harbour that was the most important link with Sydney and the rest of the colony. At first, it was nothing more than a little bay. The farmers and folk about the district would bring their produce to the harbour so that the first sailing ships and later steamships could take it to Sydney. Every few days past the post office, horses, bullocks and carts would take the produce of the district to the harbour. There was timber, butter, milk, tobacco, wheat, flour and kerosene among other things, all bound for Sydney and other parts of the colony. And of course there was coal too. Many a fine ship would bring people and supplies to the district. There was the Sophia Jane, William IV, the Maitland, Kiama and Illawarra, to name but a few. Of course, it was soon decided that a better harbour was needed. On two different occasions in the 1840s and again in the 1860s, major works were undertaken to make the harbour bigger and deeper. For the first work in the 1840s, convict labour was brought down from Sydney. Contractors were used in the 1860s when further work was carried out. Many a time with a little rain, the dirt roads would become a quagmire, with carts being bogged up to their axles. And it wasn't just the roads in the township either. No, the roads, or rather dirt tracks, all over the district were not what you're used to today. To help pay for better roads in the 1840s, tolls were introduced on the road from Kiama and Jamberoo, while in the 1870s, the road from Bulli had a toll. Certainly many things have changed from my day.
This is my wife, Catherine. What are we having for dinner tonight, dear?
Tonight we're having a very special stew.
Ah, it's a fairly typical meal back in my day. Of course, you might notice a few differences between the kitchen we're using and your kitchen at home.
There was no gas or electricity, just a wood-burning oven and stove, and in many cases, just an open fireplace. And we had no running water either, hot or cold. It wasn't until 1902 that Wollongong was given running water to the home. Before that, we had to get our fresh water from wells, streams and creeks about the district, or from the lagoon that was at the South Wollongong beach. Of course, there were many other differences between now and then. No dishwashers or washing machines. Everything was done by hand. And of course, in my day, there was no television, radio or CD players. No, nothing like that. After a fine and hearty meal, we would retire to the parlour where we could read a book or the newspaper. Well, from 1855, we did have the Illawarra Mercury, which was published every Monday. And there were other newspapers in the region too. The womenfolk could do the mending or fancy stitch work, and we'd talk about the happenings of the day. Sometimes we'd play the piano or some other musical instruments and sing songs or tell stories. The children had their toys to play with. Their toys were a much simpler affair. Things such as marbles or tops, hoops or skipping ropes.
And speaking of children, contrary to what you might think about the olden days, we did have schools.
It was in the 1850s that we had the first government school. The National School at Wollongong was opened in 1851. Before that, schools were held in various church buildings or sheds about the district. There were no school uniforms, nor books to write in. Each child would use a slate and slate pencils. As the town developed and more streets were laid out, cottages and fine houses were built in the township, along with more and more shops and quite a few hotels.
That's right, Harry. This is Harry. Harry's a town farrier. He shoots the horses and fixes the wagons here in Wollongong. In fact, he makes everything out of iron that we need for the city. He's also the horse doctor. He looks after the horses when they're feeling a little bit out of sorts.
Horses and bullocks were important for getting around the district. There were no cars, buses or trucks back in my day. And it wasn't until 1890 that we got the railway line between Sydney and Nowra. Before that, mail and passenger services to Sydney were either by ship or horse and coach. The coach used to leave from the old Queen's Hotel that was right next door to this post office. It went via Appin and Campbelltown. That was a grand day indeed when the railway line was opened. Instead of a full day's travelling by ship or horse, you could get to Sydney in less than half a day.
Mind you, there was some excitement with using man and horse to deliver the mail. We had a few incidents with bushrangers. But that's another story.
And speaking of other stories, coal was a whole new story for the region in the early days. It was 1849 that the first coal mine was opened at Mount Kira. In the years that followed, many mines were opened and closed in the Illawarra. Now, let me tell you, coal mining is a dangerous business, and never more so than in the early days. In 1887, there was a mighty disaster at the Bulli mine, where a terrible explosion took the life of 81 good men. At that time, it was the greatest disaster ever to happen in the colony. Sadly, only 15 years later, in 1902, an even bigger tragedy was to occur at the Mount Kembla mine. Just as with the Bulli disaster, the word reached the town and the call was out to every doctor, nurse, ambulanceman and miner who could help. Of the 261 men underground that day, 95 were killed and 14 injured. They were terrible happenings, remembered for a long time in the area. Of course, in the early days, there wasn't the type of medical facilities about that you have today. In my day, there was a far greater reliance on home remedies. Of course, in 1864, the Albert Memorial Hospital was built, and it served us well until the district hospital was built on Garden Hill in 1908, where the current hospital stands today in Wollongong.
In the event of any accidents, we did have an ambulance service from the early 1900s, but as you can see, the mode of transport was certainly not what you see on your roads today. But if you're thinking that our lives were a little harsh compared to yours, well, I'm here to tell you, we had ample ways and means to relax and enjoy ourselves.
In 1845, we held our very first agricultural show. There were field ploughing competitions, livestock and produce displays. The night before the first show, there was a public ball held, and many of the town folk attended. Oh, we were all in high spirits. In the years that followed, Market Square, just down the road from the museum, was used as a marketplace and showground. In 1840, some fine enterprising gentlemen formed the first Wollongong Racing Club, and each year in October, they held 3 days of horse racing that attracted men and women from all over the district.
There was also the green, down here where the basketball and the football is now played, where foot running races were held and the noble game of cricket was played.
And of course, just as it's popular today, back in the 1850s, the people of Wollongong were getting a taste of bathing in the ocean.
Well, our time together is drawing to a close. But before I go, it'd be remiss of me if I didn't talk to you a little bit about the industry of the Illawarra.
Of course, in the early days, timber was the major export from the region. Cedar cutters would come to the area and cut down the much sought-after trees, transport them to the harbour and beaches for shipping to Sydney. And coal mining has always been very important. Other industries here in the Illawarra over the years have included salt works, soap and candle factories, flour mills, coach and wagon building, brickworks, and coke making, of course.
Well, our time is up. I really must be getting back to work now. But feel free to wander around this wonderful building and see the fabulous exhibits on display. See if you can discover more ways in which the olden days, as you like to call them, are different to the way they are today. You know, today, I've only scratched the surface of the history of this grand city of Wollongong. You know, if you were to look a little further, I bet you could find a whole lot more. Well, have a great day, and I'll hope you'll come back and see me again real soon.